Well, welcome everyone to this conversation about Reuben Miller's wonderful new book, Halfway Home, Race, Punishment, and the Afterlife of Mass Incarceration. There's a book there. My name is Bruce Weston. I'm the co-director of the Justice Lab at Columbia University, and we are delighted to welcome Reuben to Columbia today. Reuben's an assistant professor at the University of Chicago in the Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy and Practice. In the coming hour, we're going to have a conversation with Reuben about Halfway Home, and we'll be joined by my good friend and colleague, Vivian Nixon. Vivian Nixon, for many years, was the executive director of College and Community Fellowship, a New York organization promoting higher education among women who have been most deeply affected by mass incarceration. She was also the inaugural board chair of Just Leadership USA. So in our format today, Reuben's going to speak a little about Halfway Home, and I think share with us a reading from the book, and then we'll pull Vivian into the conversation. Before handing off to Reuben, I want to say that I found Halfway Home a remarkable book. It's memoir, social analysis, ethnography, a moral conversation. In the large body of scholarship about mass incarceration, so much has been written about the barriers created by prisons and courts to having anything like a normal life for people who are caught up in the system. And Halfway Home does a wonderful job of describing the obstacles to finding work and reconnecting with family and friends, and the banal obstructions of prisons and parole and the courts. But I think for me, one of the really unique and powerful contributions of the book was this exploration of what I think of as moral projects that are created by mass incarceration. After incarceration, people are searching for a righteous place in their families and in their communities. They want to set their relationships right, and their families want this as well. But the moral project of being righteous, of moving beyond guilt and confession and sin, in the language of the book, confronts a harsh sociological reality. Centuries of oppression and marginalization, contemporary realities of racism and poverty. Often sociology, academic analysis, fails to take up the moral side of the equation because we're afraid that we'll somehow join in the blaming that's meted out by the courts and the prisons. So we sort of shrink from a moral language. But the reality is that people do want a righteous place in the world. And if we ignore that part of the journey after incarceration, we also wind up denying people's agency. And Halfway Home navigates this brilliantly, I think, and finds a way to hold two truths together. There's a system that creates vast obstacles to what Reuben calls citizenship, being a fully fledged member of a community. But nevertheless, people work hard to transcend the guilt and the sin that the system bestows upon them. And so with that, let me bring Reuben Miller into the conversation. Reuben, thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you for this wonderful book. You're beginning with a reading today, so let me hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bruce, for this lovely introduction. And thank you to the remarkable Reverend Vivian Nixon, who I've been a fan of for years, for joining us in this conversation. It's just wonderful. I'm going to be reading from chapter 3. The chapter is titled Thinner Man, and the reading begins in Detroit in 2014. I'm doing research out of a place called the Detroit Reentry Center. It's on Detroit's Mound Road, the east side of Detroit, and here I meet a man who I call Jimmy in the book, and I'm generally meeting men and women who are being released in this moment after heading over to something called the muster room, which is the last area that they're in before the last gray steel and plexiglass door slides open to reunite them with their families. And so a father would hug his boy close. A grandmother would reach up from her seat to embrace her long since grown child, her walker between them. Children weren't often there, but there was always some exchange between the people released from their cages and the people who picked them up, even if they were in a hurry to leave. There'd be some intimate conversation or just a few words between each pairing, maybe a nod or a glance or eyes that dance nervously from a lover to the floor. Or maybe a parent would acknowledge how much a child had grown since the last transfer. All of it signaled their loved one was known and cared for, even if he made a mistake, even if she hadn't visited in some time. Some people made a beeline for the exit, their loved ones trailing close behind, but the relief on their faces when that last door buzz was almost always there. They had been in prison, but now they were on their way home. Taking in this scene, I almost missed Jimmy Caldwell, who walked out of the detention center alone. He showed up early and had a cup of coffee in the waiting area of the University of Michigan's Detroit Center in Midtown, where we would have our first interview. Everyone who met Jimmy commented on how nice he was. A stocky man, he appeared somehow vulnerable, hanging on your every word as if it mattered in some profound way. And while he looked at you directly when he talked, he never made eye contact. I invited him from the table where he was drinking coffee with lots of cream and sugar to the room where we'd have our first interview. Jimmy moved quickly, and we covered the basics quickly. He had a 10th grade education and had been arrested at least 20 times. This started when he was 16. High school was hard. He tried Job Corps, but it wasn't for him. He sold dope, used dope, and went to prison for property crimes. After a 3-year sentence for grand larceny, he finished a 6-month drug treatment program. He was happy about that and used lots of treatment language, saying things about people, places, and things, and codependence, and enablers, and my madness, and my disease. I wondered about his life, but I need to get beyond the things he'd learned to say in treatment groups and beyond the stories you hear when you watch Black gangster movies from the 1990s, like the hard life of violence and addiction that poor Black kids are presumed to find themselves in every day. Black life in cities like Detroit has been so caricatured. And these caricatures have led to bad policy, welfare reform, the war on crime, a million mentorship programs that try to replace missing Black fathers. This is despite 2 full decades of research that show us Black fathers are there, that Black fathers help with homework and go to games and share moments of affection like all fathers. In fact, Black fathers spend more time with their children than fathers from any other racial group, so says the research, even when they have multiple children, and even when those children have different last names, something social scientists call family complexity. But the news about exceptional Black men who teach low-income kids complicated handshakes, or the YouTube clips of white principals doing the latest dances with little Black girls and boys, and the viral videos of police officers playing basketball with kids in dreadlocks, and the memes where 100 Black men show up for the first day of school with the prominently displayed caption like "real fathers" or "real Black men," convince us this is abnormal. And it's not just bad policy. Lessons from 1,000 studies on missing Black men and 1,000 more on what sociologists call social disorganization show up in the first interview I do with almost everyone I sit down with. So do the slogans that moralize Black life, along with phrases like, "you know how we are," and some version of "what our people really need to do is." And they're the things that preachers and pundits and presidents say when Black men gather. All of this typically comes up within the first hour of the interview. Social scientists might call this social desirability bias, meaning people tell you the stories they think you want to hear. There are interview techniques to get past all of this, but it takes a while to move beyond the noise in people's heads, and it takes more than a few hours and a few cups of coffee to really learn about someone's life. I had a plan. I would ask Jimmy about his family and about what it was like for him to grow up on the east side of Detroit. I'd ask him about how the city had changed since his last time locked up, and I'd ask what it was like for him to come home. I'm the only boy, he said quickly, confidently. He had 4 sisters. When I asked where he was in the pecking order, he sat up in his chair, laughing. "I'm the baby." "You're the baby?" I said, thinking I knew what he meant. When I told him, "I'm the baby too," we laughed together, loudly, 2 middle-aged men sitting in an office in Midtown, decades removed from our childhoods, thinking about some pleasant thing from so long ago. But Jimmy stopped laughing abruptly. I was surprised by how quiet he got and how quickly the mood changed. He wiped his eyes, sighed, leaned his head on his hand. So he took a long pause, Tears started to stream down his cheeks. I was kind of spoiled. I pretty much got everything I wanted. 30 seconds of silence. Jimmy was full on crying now, no longer bothering to wipe his face. His dim brown eyes red and full, his voice soft and broken, he went on. So when crack came, it was a lot of disappointment, I being the only boy. Is that why you're upset, I asked? What a dumb question. I didn't really know what to say. There was a grown man crying in my office. So I handed him the box of tissues we kept for times like this and sat with him in silence. It's not where I want to be right now, he whimpered for a while. My sisters, they getting there. It's getting there, you know. I wanted to know more. He told me his sisters had helped raise him, that they were close growing up. He wanted to keep it that way, but that's not how it turned out. Everybody kind of looked up to me, he explained, back to wiping the sides of his face. Like I said, it was a lot of disappointment. Time after time, they give me the benefit of the doubt. Basically, I shit on them. What about your parents, I asked, trying to find my bearings. Well, my father, he was married, but he wasn't married to my mom. I got 4 sisters, Jimmy said, explaining they were his half-sisters. That is, they were not all his father's biological children. His mother had children from previous relationships, and his father had a family of his own. He took care of 2 families, Jimmy said. He treated all my sisters like they were his. He'd go home, but I seen my daddy every day. Were you close, I asked? Yeah, we was close at the time, he said. Jimmy's father died when Jimmy was young, cancer. He was 82 or 83. Jimmy was just starting high school then. He was 14 and at a new school with a mother raising 5 children. Things started getting different. I don't know if it was because my mother didn't really know how to raise a boy. I was a baby, so if I want it, I'm gonna tell my daddy and I get it, he said. But after my father died, I stopped getting all the perks, Jimmy said. Jimmy's father was an auto worker at a time when people still had pensions. His mother made Jimmy and his 4 sisters take their dead father's last name to ensure they would be taken care of financially, in Jimmy's words. And there were no more perks other than a few $100s that came in the mail each month from the Social Security office. And that went to Jimmy's mother. Jimmy's father, the man who Jimmy saw every day, the one who took care of his sisters as if they were his own, was gone. I wanted to wear all the good shit I've been wearing, Jimmy said, but it wasn't that kind of party. It felt like everyone was against me, so I started doing dumb shit. Jimmy would wait for the mailman to come each month. I figured, well, that's my check. I should be able to do what I want with that money. And I wouldn't think about bills and none of that, he told me, reflecting on his route into trouble. This was the reasoning of a 14-year-old boy, one who didn't realize that the mailman was delivering his check, or that the place where his father developed cancer might have some responsibility toward his family. And it wasn't just his family. Cancer rates among Black auto workers rivaled rates in the famed Cancer Alley, that 85-mile stretch along the Mississippi River of petroleum refineries and chemical plants that claimed the lives of a generation of Black men. Auto workers were dying. Leukemia, colon and pancreatic cancers, lung cancers, cancer of the stomach, cancer of the liver, brain cancer, cancers of all kinds claimed the lives of so many Black people in Detroit. Started to steal, Jimmy said. Like me and the other guys in the neighborhood, when the mailman come, we take the mail, tried to cash the check ourselves. A whole group of boys had lost their fathers to the auto plants. The same plants that convinced the government to use eminent domain to demolish 1,500 homes on the promise that they'd bring good jobs. This was the 1980s. Those same plants left, having never brought those good jobs, providing a fraction of those jobs. Those same plants did not cut checks to the boys' families, but they went to the Capitol with their cap in their hand during the Great Recession to ask the government for a check, and they left with one. Jimmy and his friends stole the meager Social Security checks the state sent to their mothers, but the plan didn't work, Jimmy said. No one would cash the checks. So there the boys were, their names on checks their dead fathers had earned with no way to access the funds. That's when they left high school, he said. The rest of this story is predictable. Jimmy ran the streets, stole and started selling dope. By 16, he was using. By 17, he had been to jail. By 18, he was in prison. He lied to his family and lost jobs. He stole things from people's homes. He used more drugs and did time over and over again. 6 months for stealing car radios, 12 months for drug distribution, 18 months for grand larceny, dozens of arrests for trespassing, for using, for stealing scrap metal, for not reporting to his parole officer on time when he was high. I feel like I got left behind, Jimmy said, and I understood. All this time, the baby, the one who saw his father every day, was all alone. Thank you.
Well, that is that's so powerful, Reuben. I mean, as sociologists, we know, we teach our students, right? C. Wright Mills says sociological imagination is where biography meets history, and this is sociological imagination. So your three opening chapters are called Confession, Guilt, Cinnamon, and Jimmy's story comes from that third chapter, Cinnamon, echoing Nina Simone. How is this a starting point for understanding mass incarceration in America? I see that you're excavating, and there's a superficial reality that we often tell a story about, but you're digging underneath that.
Oh, I appreciate the question so much. So the presumption about crime and incarceration in the United States is as you well know, and of course, as Reverend Nixon well knows, is that there's a one-on-one relationship between what people do and the consequence they receive, you know? And so beyond questions of innocence or guilt for a hot second, which I try to take on in the book, the presumption is that you know, you do the crime, you do the time, and there's so much that we don't see. And what good liberals, I think, have tried to do is they tried to say, well, they're mitigating circumstances. In fact, there's a carve out in the law for mitigating circumstances. So, you know, a good legal theorist will talk about that, right? The mitigating circumstances, the thing you think about. So, for example, we're watching the George Chauvin trial now, and we're watching him murder this man on television, and the defense attorney is trying to introduce mitigating circumstances. Well, there was a crowd. Well, he's big and black and scary, you know, and wouldn't any reasonable person think that they should be afraid? And wouldn't any reasonable person choke the life out of that man? You know, what are the mitigating circumstances that make the action, whether it's right or wrong, reasonable, is what the mitigating circumstance does. I think that's an interesting line of attack for this problem, where we make everybody a quote product of the environment. And that matters on some level. It goes to the extent of one's charity. It goes as far as you can go with your charity, as far as you can see somebody is sympathetic, that's how far it goes. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to explain, in some ways, the series of events, some of which have to do with decisions that people make in a moment. Sometimes you make that decision when you're 14 years old and you steal that check. You know, that was an action. That happened. And maybe the mitigating circumstances, the death of Jimmy's father and the death of Jimmy's boy's father, a whole gang of boys, what we call a gang if they were standing around today, lost their fathers to the auto plants who cut no checks for them. 20 years later, no checks for them. Maybe that's one set of explanations. And another thing that we might note is how the multiple arrests coalesce into the eventual decision that this person is in fact a criminal, is in fact violent, is in fact guilty. So my guys would be arrested 10 times, 15 times, 20 times, 15 times on average in my sample. They'd be arrested over and over and over again, sometimes for standing around, sometimes for doing things like we understood. So for example, if that was me, I'd be stealing those checks too, if I was Jimmy. So sometimes for things that we understand that we might call a crime, but sometimes it's for absolutely nothing. It's for boys standing on the corner together doing things what little boys do, they play. But by the time they finally break a law, because they're taught, there's a pedagogy at work here. They're taught about their relationship with the law, about their relationship with the state, about their relationship even one to another, so much so that running from the police becomes a game if you grow up in poor Black neighborhoods that are over-policed, et cetera. So that by the time they actually break a law, let's say that law is drug possession, now they've got a pattern of criminality. We've presumed their guilt before they were old enough to confront the laws of God or man in any reasonable way, in any appreciable way. We presume that guilt, we pursued that guilt, and then when they finally get caught, we drop it on them. And there it is. And so this is Jimmy. The rest of Jimmy's story is that he spends 8 years in prison without access to psychotropic medications because his mental health technician in the prison presumes he's a criminal, quote, criminal drug addict, and says you have a drug problem, not a mental health issue. So there's no understanding for any of the context that produces these things. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to break this kind of wooden, inflexible calculus about the relationship between crime and incarceration. We know that it's not a one-to-one relationship. And I'm trying to do a little bit more than just give reasons why people might commit crimes. I'm trying to show what work systems do in the production of crime and criminality, in the making, in this case, of boys who steal. And in how we see Jimmy. We meet Jimmy when he's middle-aged, but Jimmy was that same 14-year-old boy who had lost his daddy, who we thought shouldn't be there, but he was.
Yeah, yeah. Let me bring Vivian Nixon into the conversation now, and Vivian, I'm going to go off our script a little bit and sort of pursue the line of conversation that Reuben is setting up for us here, and one of the things I hear him saying is that both the system and sometimes liberal analysis sort of trades in a black and white moral universe in which people are either good or bad, and in political disagreement we're wrestling over who's good and who's bad, but in the complexity of people's lives, in the historical context that people grow up and confront, the worlds that people are often dealing with are just drenched with moral ambiguity, actually, and it's very difficult to draw bright lines of good and bad. I feel you and I have talked about this a lot. How do you think about that? How do you think about that in a philosophical context, in a spiritual context?
So, I'm about to make things even more complicated. You already know this. So not only do we tend to view individuals as good and bad, we tend to look at history as binary in the same way, and to leap to conclusions that either swing all the way in one direction or the other. So there's the complexity of the ally, the liberal ally, who blames everything on systemic racism and structural inequality, and the only thing that we can do is blame everything on the system, and no individual has any individual responsibility, when in fact the people that I know who have been involved in the justice system often want to, in real dialogue, when real dialogue is allowed to happen, want to take some form of responsibility for their own behaviors and for their own imagination of what the future could look like. But that's, we're moving more and more into a space where that's not allowed. All you're allowed to say is prisons are horrible in their cages and no one should ever be in them. And if you try to go into a deeper conversation, it gets contentious in this environment. What we fail to do is recognize that the layers of the system we have built did not start with the criminal justice system as we know it. It started, and there are references to this in the book, in a system where it wasn't just the enslavement of Black people that helped build the America that we have. In the beginning, there were other people who were suffering some of the same types of abuses and atrocities that Black people suffered in this country. Their indentured servitude was no picnic. Their families were hurt, harmed, their women were raped. There was before the invention of American Blackness, is what I call it, because Blackness isn't the same everywhere, there was this kind of almost equal suffering between the enslaved and the indentured servant until we figured out or the power structures figured out that if these people came together and understood that everything that's happening to us is happening to us, and together we can stop this, we can overpower this oppression. Well, then we had to create something to separate those folks. And very much the same things are happening in systems today. We are creating these different narratives of respectability, narratives of redemption, narratives of personal responsibility that decide who gets to pass the risk assessment test, who gets early release, who gets violated when they have a dirty urine, and who doesn't. That is not doing anything to stop the perpetuation of all of the evils of this system. And what is so brilliant about the Sinnerman chapter is that the rhythm of it, the actual rhythm of it, and it came through when you were reading it out loud. If you know Nina Simone at all, you can't read that chapter without hearing it. You hear that rhythmic piano as you're reading. And as you're reading, you hear it as she gets more and more intense with that rhythm, and then escalates to the fact that in the video she's up and dancing. So you move right with that. And that is what I think has happened with incarceration in this country from the 70s until now. We've been in this place where we have had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and it's gotten to the point where we're frantic now. And we're really looking for that place where we can rest, where we can really find our true identity that's not imposed upon us by our allies sometimes, right? Or by a set of static questions that say nothing about who we really are. That's the fight we're in. And that's the fight that this book highlights, that is new and different and fresh.
Yeah. How would you respond, Reuben?
Oh, I'm just touched. I'm just touched, and I just agree. I just agree, and I think this is very much so a part of what I was just trying to say. You know, we strip people of their agency in powerful ways, and that's where the dynamic life is lived within all the oppression. You know, people manage to make lives for themselves within all of this. You know, it's interesting. It's interesting that the boys find each other in this little section. You know, boys find each other to commiserate over the death of their father that's taken from them by auto plants, by the advance of an industry, something that we say is good, that we lament when we talk about deindustrialization. We say it's good that the auto plants were there. Look, the jobs have gone away. Those were good union jobs. Those are good union jobs that killed a generation of Black men, leaving their boys alone. And then we say, father absence or something like that. Like, this is the framework that we use to understand their lives. And the boys say, we're together. Let's get these checks, boys. The boys go get those checks. I can look at that as crime. I can look at that as community. I can see that as something powerful and beautiful, and try to understand, you know, what Black life is doing, what Black people are doing underneath the weight of all of these things that are sort of pressing down. And what they're doing is that they're forming family, and they're making friendships, and they're finding love, and they're being together. Not all in this one example, of course, but just thinking about, you know, the totality of what happens. And that's not what we look at or for. What we look at is, were you rearrested in 3 years? That's our question. You know, what's the likelihood you'll be rearrested in a year? And let me concentrate these services on you, because I think there's something deficient in your thinking. So let's make sure that you have enough tenacity, grit, and trustworthiness built up inside of you, so that you can reframe how you see the social situation that's bearing down on you. So you can draw from some inner reservoir of strength that's not important in any other context, just this one. This one that keeps you out of the jail or prison. That's it. That's it. It's the only place where it's important. It's anyway. So I think that we have to think more carefully about people's lives, the lives that people make for themselves, which include choices and decisions too. Like choice and decision, that's not a bad word to me. I think people make choices in the moment. This means people cause harm. You know, and of course people cause harm, and people can repair harm that they cause. They can participate in the repair of it if we allow them. We don't allow them. We don't allow them.
We don't allow some people, and
Yes.
and we don't evaluate harm the same way for everybody, and that is a major part of the problem. And we see this all the time. We will reframe harm depending upon who it is that's being harmed and who it is that is creating the harm. Because we never see the Black boys in communities who are more often victims than anybody else as victims. We don't give them the right to be treated as victims when they've been victimized at every level, from interpersonal to structural, for their entire lives, and are expected to move past that in some way, to overcome that. And what many of the programs that we've done over time, including the Second Chance program, which, it was $165 million to solve the problems of 2.4 million people who were coming out of prisons. And that's about, I used to talk about this all the time, so I know the math. It's $68 per person. Okay. So if the Second Chance Act was supposed to solve this, they underestimated what the cost is to rebuild a life after incarceration, because so much is stripped away, and it's what is stripped away is so much more than the ability to earn a job. And what we built was a system that said, I think we're trying to break out of that. But from 2004, when Bush stood at that podium in the State of the Union and said, America is the land of second chances, all the way until recently, we built programs that said, if we can just get you to behave a little better, we will get you a job, you will have a place to live, and you will be okay. No one ever talked about the type of transformation that really changes people's lives. Because what we were trying to do is to get people in a condition, and this is a little bit redundant of what Reuben just said, we want you to be able to tolerate the conditions that we created for you to live in. We want to give you the skills to tolerate that. But we do not want to give you the power to change it. There are other interventions that absolutely give people the power to change the structures that are subjugating their full humanity. And those are the solutions we need to be focused on. And there are real reasons why we're not focused on them.
So one direction this conversation makes me think about, I'm sort of hearing this as a conversation about the sources of community, of social solidarity among people, and mass incarceration is just enormously destructive of community and social solidarity. The prison itself is a literal embodiment of segregation and separation from the community, and the effects that flow from that, the afterlife that Reuben talks about, echoes over the life course, echoes across communities, and so the thing I'm thinking about, right, and this is sort of going back to where you started, Vivian. Sort of think, what lessons can we take from the analysis that Reuben provides of people coming home from prison to think about our politics? That's how I heard your comment, Vivian. And so in thinking about this project of rebuilding social solidarity or building social solidarity, establishing community, so far, right, in the correctional perspective, all our focus is on the person who's been incarcerated, and they have the burden to find their place. You could take another view. The work of social solidarity has to be done by the community to create a place for the person who has been incarcerated. So sort of thinking about our politics, what does that look like, right? Who are the allies in that project, right, where the thing that has to change is not the person who has been incarcerated, has done what they've done in their life, but the society to be a welcoming home for someone who perhaps has harmed come into conflict with their community. What politics, what are the implications for our politics, I suppose? So I put that to both of you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, in the book, so my dear brother, I know this is also Vivian's dear brother, Ronald Simpson Bay, forces us to wrestle with what it means to make a place where people belong. And that's the place I come down to in the book, a place of belonging. So the problem is, I argue, a problem of citizenship, because citizenship is a political community. Citizenship is a community where people belong, where they have things to do, where they do them together, but where power flows in a particular kind of way. And mass incarceration routes people into an alternate kind of track of that. And so what we've done is we've cut people off. We've broken associations. You know, Daniel Ellen, of course, is thinking and writing about this right now, and talking about it publicly. But a concrete example of this is the association clause that's on every condition of release. When you walk out the door, you get handed a piece of paper, and somewhere between, you know, don't use illicit substances and stay away from the scene of the crime, I suppose, or something like that, it's going to be, you may not associate with known offenders. Well, slow down. Wait, what are you saying to me? What exactly are you saying? My cellie, my bunkie, the person I spent all this time with, I can't associate with them, or their cousins who've been through the system too, or I can't talk to anybody who lives in the neighborhood that I'm returning to. I'm coming from a so-called $1 million block, right? So who on this block can I talk to? You know, we spent all this money rounding them up into the system, giving them records, making sure that they're on this in this cycle of perpetual punishment. So who exactly can I associate with? Well, the problem with that is that association is the bedrock of the democratic project. Like this is how we get things done in this country. We get together. We figure out a project together that affect that. We have some likeness too, by the way. We see this in jury selection. Most states saying that you can't sit on a jury if you've got a criminal record. This means I'll never go before a so-called jury of my peers, because no one really understands what it's like to sit in a cage. Nobody knows that. Nobody understands it. Nobody knows what it's like to turn your life around once you do it. These are all the millions of ways, the millions of details, so says James Baldwin, that spell out to us that we are worthless human beings. But to take that metaphor, it's the millions of ways that we make it so that people have no place in the social world. And so the politics is a politic that wouldn't do harm. The politics is a politic of hospitality, of inviting in, of welcome, as you say. So what would it mean? What would it mean for us to think about in what ways might we prepare the worlds of work to receive somebody with a criminal record? In what ways might we prepare our housing markets? I'm thinking about material needs right now, food, clothing, and shelter. In what ways might we prepare the purveyors of one's material needs to be welcoming for people who need those things? for people with criminal records who we've locked out. So in other words, what if we operated from a framework of hospitality? This is the politic of welcome, of bringing in, of caring for, of nurture, of thriving even, making sure you have what you need, not just to get by, to eke by from day to day, not just minimum wage job that the boss can fire you here or there, not absent of labor market protections like everybody else just because you're lucky to get the job. Certainly not a politic of 19,000 labor market restrictions like we have right now, but one of welcome, one of hospitality, one of thriving, one of making a place, one of community, one of embrace, even for people who perhaps we're afraid of. What if we took that on as an ethical commitment? This is why Ronald brings me to this place at the end of the book. You know, Ronald can tell his own story, but a part of that story is Ronald suffered a loss in his family. His child is taken from him, and he advocates for the person who took his child from him, because that person was a minor, not because he loved that kid, but because he thought everybody deserves a place in this world. You know, he can tell his own story, and he tells it much more powerfully than I do. But that's the framework. It's an ethic of care, an ethic of hospitality, a commitment to human thriving, a commitment one to another. That for me is the politic.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's levels of, so there's the individual politic of the freedom to have your own ideas about the way you want to develop your identity and find your place of redemption, whatever that means to you. There's the interpersonal politic, because it is a kind of death, as you say in the book. It is a social death, but it's also a civic death, and a relational death. And I'll give a couple of really concrete examples. The way in which it is this death of personal identity is people make assumptions about what success ought to look like. It looks like you completed the program, you got your certificate, you are successful, you're okay. Or it looks like you soar like Ronald Simpson Bay, right? And you become a national leader and a national spokesperson. Or you soar. I knew this was going to get to me. You soar like a Vivian Nixon, and you run a successful program helping hundreds of women get college degrees who are all very successful now and doing things to help other women. And you're writing a book, and and you have your MFA, and on the outside, it's like, well, you see, it can be done. We can give people back an identity in which they find acceptance in this world, and they feel okay, and they no longer feel like they have to live in an economy of favors. But that's not true, because it never goes away. In this very moment, just like the guys in Emmaus house might have felt sometimes when people, passers-by, were coming by to look at the program, they felt caged again. They felt as if they were in a zoo being looked at and examined to see, is this what works? There are moments when I can be on a Zoom just like that and feel just like that. 21 years later, with an MFA from Columbia. This is the level that our allies don't understand. That when I get to this point in my life with this level of success, there are things you can still say as an ally that hurt me, because if my opinion differs from yours and I get lumped in with those elitists or those reformists because I have not yet fully developed my own language of abolition yet, that hurts me, because there's something different going on the inside of me, because I'm living the afterlife of incarceration and not the same life you're living.
Yeah. How do we transcend that, Vivian?
There's only one way, and it's hard. It's not easy. We do not easily exist for long periods of time in a space of vulnerability. You know, we approach it and then we run like hell. And I remember a moment, I was in the Square One executive session, and my first attempt at writing a paper was really bad. I mean, the ideas weren't bad, the writing was horrible. The structure was bad. It wasn't clear. I knew that. And when I presented the paper and got the feedback, everyone was extremely kind. But internally, I felt like such a complete failure. I felt there was no one I could share that with. How difficult that moment was for me. But the next day, I walked up to, I think it was Anamika. It was either Anamika or Catherine or both together. And they asked me how I was doing the day after I had presented the paper. And I just broke down and cried. And in that moment, they did exactly the right thing. They neither rushed to try to console me, nor did they appear uncomfortable about it. They just let it happen. And then we moved on.
Mm.
And then, you know, I continue to redraft that very same paper until one day it'll be what I want it to be. But we have to allow each other to be vulnerable in these spaces because the healing has to happen. I believe that if those of us who are on that real path to full citizenship, to full inclusion of our society post incarceration, are allowed to heal in ways that develop our true identity and bring our true gifts to the world, there's no end to the coalition of power we can bring to this country in terms of changing the entire way we view policing, the way we view public safety, and the way we treat each other based on the myth of white supremacy. But I think that healing has to happen.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. We have a question on the Q&A board that asks about the narrative of our national history. And I often think about that question in the context of the political conversation that we're having. Are there the resources in our national narrative? Are there the symbolic and conceptual tools that provide space to talk in the way that Vivian is talking about, that can accommodate healing, provide space for healing, reckon with a history of enslavement and dehumanization? Do we have that in our history? Is the future that we're talking about, is that imaginable given the history that we have, given the national narrative about our history?
I think that there at every moment of um, at every moment of state violence, there have been people writing about, speaking up about, singing against, doing poetry, doing research at great risk to themselves at every moment. So no, the narrative is bogus. Like the narrative is a narrative of innocence and perfection, like perfecting the union. You know, like moving. Like it's bogus. Like anybody who's paying any attention, anybody who pays any attention to their own stuff, you could even have like a white immigrant story and ask yourself that question. You don't have to be Black, formerly incarcerated, Asian, American right now, right? Who are getting, who are being, who we're just recognizing the violence that they've been facing for decades and decades and decades and years and years and years, centuries since they've been here. You know, a violence that we're starting to recognize, finally paying attention to. You could ask any, you don't even have to be Native American, Indigenous American who die at greater rates than even Black people at the hands of police, but we don't talk about that one bit at all because we've literally put them on reservations and in the reservation of our imagination, shelved somewhere away, distant. But there have been people from all these communities at every moment, at every moment in history, at every moment of state violence that have been speaking up, out, and against. And those are tools that we can use to help unseat this narrative of innocence, this logic of progress. You know, and there's a radical doubt that they maintain, and there's a closeness to their own experiences, to the experiences of their people, and to the experiences of the people that they care for, that shows up in that work. And we should call on that work, especially in this moment.
We have to elevate that work. And to be fair, in the last 3 or 4, maybe even 5 years, there have been really people who have a lot of resources who are willing to do that. But I think there's room for even more of a lessening of the reins of how those resources are used. Like, really let go of the reins and let people do whatever it is they need to do to dispense of that rage. And it may, for some people, it will come out in being involved in every rally in the street whenever police brutality rears its ugly head. It will be in the writing of some people. It will be in the visual art of some people. It will be in rebellions that look more radical to us than some people are comfortable with. It will be in creating a long-term vision of complete abolition for some people. Whatever that looks like, our allies need to say, if that is what is going to free you to imagine the world and help us imagine the world where you feel truly liberated, then that's what you should do. But instead, we come up with prescriptions.
Well, Vivian, if it's okay, I would love to go back to a point that you raised earlier about vulnerability. I think that's so right, and I think the vulnerability cuts both ways. So to people in power or whatever, there's a requirement of a kind of vulnerability. Things might not shake out the way you think it's going to shake out with your purse strings. You know, you might not get the outcome exactly. This is your point, right? Like loosening the reins. It requires a kind of vulnerability for people who've been harmed. It requires a hospitality, welcome, requires a commitment to a particular kind of vulnerability. It is possible that one could be harmed again. People are harmed every day. It is possible that one could be harmed again. To the person who's trying to change, it requires a kind of vulnerability to do this introspection stuff. But the issue that we have, and the reason why I think we fail so often, is because we only require this level of vulnerability from people who we're afraid of. We don't require it from anybody else. We certainly don't require it from people in power. And this is why these writers in these artists and these scholars, sometimes every once in a while you get a good scholar, every once in a while there's plenty of good scholars. I'm cracking jokes, but like these folks who are students who are paying attention to the moment, you know, they're giving us the tools, but it requires a kind of vulnerability to accept it, to accept the critique. You know, anyway.
Yeah. Where are we at right now, do you think? I mean, it seems where there's so much, we're sort of in this historically ambivalent time where from day to day, we feel completely divided and cruel and marginalizing as a society. And the next day, we can see great possibility. How do you feel about the future of a politics that is welcoming, that celebrates an ethic of hospitality? What are the chances of that now? Where are we now?
I think we're closer than we may have ever been, despite the atrocity of a George Floyd and the line of questioning that the defense is spewing out before the American public. There's a bigger conversation now than ever about words that used to be unspoken, except in very small circles. Abolition, reparations, reckoning. Those words can be heard and seen and felt all over. And if we can just figure out that that can look different ways and we can all have an input into that long-term goal. I love the Marion Kava's statement that the struggle is eternal. So roll up your sleeves and get to work. This is just, it's never going to not be a struggle to keep going on this path toward true freedom and true equality and liberation. But we've got to be engaged in that work all the time in the ways that we each know best to do it. And then we bring others along with us instead of making it a combat amongst those of us who are on the same side. Let's join together and collaborate and figure out how to keep inching the needle in our direction until everybody understands that freedom really is best for all of us. And I think we're closer than we have ever been. And it's thanks to the work of people who were writing about this and thinking about this long before the term mass incarceration was invented. It's the Black feminist movement, it's the Black arts movement, it's all of the pre-civil rights, the Reconstruction movement. And every time we've gotten closer, that what we say is we retrench, right? Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think we're going to retrench this time because too many young people don't understand a world with that kind of vitriol and violence and hatred. And the more we can influence them with educating through curriculum, through engagement, through art, through conversation, I think we're going to win. Hope is the only antidote.
Yeah, that's
Hopefully.
beautiful. As we come up to our time, Reuben, what do you think?
Well, I just agree. I just agree. I think that's right. Yeah.
Well, that is a beautiful note on which to end this conversation. I wish we had 3 more hours. I wish we were all in New York together so we could go out to dinner together to talk about this more. It is so wonderful to have you both in conversation around this incredible book. Let me show you the book again. It's Halfway Home by Reuben Miller. Thank you so much, Vivian Nixon. Thank you so much, Reuben Miller. Good night, everyone. Thank you for listening, and pick up a copy of Halfway Home.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this was a 2-hour conversation.